Hi, I think we're live. My name is Kent Pekel and I am president here at Search Institute. This is part of our weekly video blog where we give those of you who are out there and interested a quick glimpse of the work that we're doing to study and strengthen the developmental relationships in kids' lives that help them grow and thrive. As I talked about last week, our work is showing that when kids experience those developmental relationships, they're much likely to be on the path to becoming thriving and contributing young adults and to avoiding risk behaviors and a lot of other bad stuff. Unfortunately, our work is also showing that far too many kids today, in very different circumstances, are not experiencing those developmental relationships often enough or intensively enough. And that raises a big question that has big consequences for the future of young people, and I would even argue our country and society, and that is why. Why does there seem to be this relationship gap in the lives of a lot of young people today? Of course, there's no simple explanation for that, but a lot of our work is within organizations that serve kids, so schools, out-of-school time programs, community programs, social service programs, mentoring programs. And one of the things that we've seen is that within those settings, there's a lot of barriers to building relationships with and among kids. Some of those barriers are pretty predictable. There's not enough time, there's not enough money. One of the biggest barriers we're finding is the how-to barrier. There are few teachers or youth workers or out-of-school time staff who've not at some point in their careers been told by somebody, build better relationships with kids or build stronger relationships among kids. And a lot of them may have sat there in the back of their heads thinking, great, how do I do that? Especially across lines of difference that can be both really energizing but also challenging. So in future blogs we'll talk about some ways to build some of those bridges. But today I thought I would quickly talk about one of the barriers to building relationships that has come out of our work that frankly surprised me and some of my colleagues the most. And for lack of a more exact way to describe it, I would call it personal and professional pride. This first emerged for me a couple of years ago when I was doing a day-long workshop in a high school. And it was about our work on developmental relationships, and I thought it was going great. And I think for most of the faculty in that high school it was. We began the day talking about their personal relationships that mattered when they were growing up, and then beginning to look at the data and research on what we're learning about relationships and then applying it to their professional practice. But at a break, two teachers came up to me and actually were quite upset. One was even in tears and said, they said, everything you're talking about here is saying that we're bad teachers and maybe even bad people. And I was a little bit taken aback. Of course, it was a break in a big workshop with all the staff in a high school, so I didn't have time to stop and just address it with those two folks at that moment. And luckily, there were some other teachers that were there when they said that, who said that they weren't experiencing the workshop in the same way. But obviously, it stuck with me, and I thought about it a lot afterward. And as we continued to do our work in organizations that serve kids, this theme recurred. And I think at its root, it's about the fact that because people who go into work with kids, whether it's in the youth development field or in schools, feel so deeply and sincerely about building relationships with kids, and because building relationships is considered to be such a basic competency that's required for people who work with kids, that suggesting that we could build better relationships, we could build more intensive, more developmental relationships with all kids, can feel like a fundamental threat to their professional and even their personal pride, their self-worth. If you're not good at building relationships with kids, you must be a bad teacher or a bad youth worker or maybe even a bad person. So this isn't a phenomenon that we found that exists with all or even most people in these organizations, but with surprising frequency, it exists in some. So what do we do? On one hand, we could just tell these people to stop being so sensitive and don't take it personally and suck it up, and we're going to go on with the workshop or with the improvement strategy because we know relationships are important and everybody get on the bus. I think, as you can probably tell, that is not particularly likely to succeed, and so I would sort of highlight two approaches to dealing with what we might call the professional and personal pride barrier when it comes to strengthening relationships in an organization. The first is be proactive and get out ahead of it. So now when I do a workshop, I never start out without saying, the fact that we're going to be here talking today about how we can build stronger relationships with more kids is not meant to suggest that you're not already working hard to do that already. It's just that in the spirit of continuous improvement and in trying to especially reach kids who need us the most, We're never finished, and so the work that we're doing here is about making what might be already good even better and maybe even great. So that's one approach. A related approach, though, and I think something that's more at the heart of our work at Search Institute, is to define building relationships with kids as a complex and critical enterprise that's just as important as the work we do to write curricula or design programs or offer kids social services. And that when we define building relationships not as something mystical that certain people are born to do and others can't, but that as a critical discipline that we can learn from people who do it instinctively, but that everybody who wants to impact kids' lives can and should continually study and improve at. And when we frame relationships in that way, suggesting that a school, a youth program, a mentoring partnership could be more effective in building relationships feels less like a personal threat to the people working in that organization and more like something that we do to improve our outcomes for kids. One of the interesting ways that I found recently to try and do that is actually to reach beyond education or youth development for a few analogies. And I find one of the most useful places to do that is healthcare. And there are a few really interesting examples of hospitals and hospital systems trying to actually reinvent that old notion of a doctor-patient relationship in some pretty productive ways. A few years ago at the Cleveland Clinic, they did an interesting study where they had doctors spend the same amount of time with patients, but in one group they had the doctor remain standing for the entire consult, and in the other group they had the doctor sit. And then they surveyed the patients and asked about their experience and how long they thought the doctor had spent with them. And invariably, the doctor who sat down at eye level with the patient was perceived to have spent much more time and been much more responsive than the doctor who remained standing. A small, small difference, but something that in that really important interaction between doctor and patient seemed to have made a really significant shift. Another example that I've sometimes used is in the Carolinas health system. A number of years ago, they actually launched a strategy to get employees, not just physicians, but also nurse practitioners, to listen to a patient for 2 straight minutes before interrupting, and then before responding, say to them, "I want to make sure I understood you correctly," and repeat back what they'd heard. Again, they found that simple relational technique produced a significant shift in that patient experience. So sometimes reaching beyond our field to find examples in other fields, especially a widely respected field like medicine, can be a useful way to start making this mental shift. And we're finding in our work with organizations that serve kids that when we actually reframe relationships as something that people should be born to do, and that if you're any good, you already know how to do, and instead shift to relationship building as something that's challenging and complex but incredibly critical for youth outcomes and rewarding, it puts in place a productive mind shift that opens the door to some really exciting things. We're going to be continuing to look at this issue in the years ahead at Search Institute, and we invite and eagerly await your thoughts and questions about how we can actually support those of you out there who are trying to increase the number and the power of developmental relationships in kids' lives. Thanks for tuning in.